Hi, my name is Andrea Goyen, and I'm the Environmental Literacy and Sustainability Coordinator at the San Mateo County Office of Education. And in this video, I'm going to provide an introduction to the concept of trauma and how trauma is related to environmental problems like pollution and climate change. There will be a second video that goes into more of the concept of how what administrators and teachers can do to bring trauma-informed practices into their school in a way that is really addressing environmental issues and climate change. So I'm going to share my screen here and walk you through some of these introductory slides and issues. So when it comes to trauma, I think it's really important to start with just a very basic definition of trauma. And really understanding that trauma is a response to distressing or disturbing events. These can be like a series of events, or it could just be a one-time event. And the impact of that is it overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It'll cause feelings of helplessness or hopelessness. It can diminish their sense of self and their ability to even just like feel a full range of emotional experiences. Now, over here on the right, you can see it says that trauma is something that people can experience directly, but it's also can be traumatic to witness some of these things as well. So going a little further, I think it's really necessary to distinguish between a couple of the different types of trauma. And in this case, we're going to really focus in pretty exclusively on acute trauma and chronic trauma. And we're going to talk mostly about children and youth, although some of the things we're going to talk about also scale more broadly to any age group. So focusing in on children and youth, a lot of research has been done to identify what are some of the really adverse childhood experiences that you would qualify as trauma. So you can see here things like abuse, neglect, just a dysfunctional household. All of these things can be considered trauma and trauma inducing, and they can happen in a way that's very acute or also in a way that's chronic and building over time. Indicators of trauma, I think, are really important for educators to understand that it might show up differently in different age groups, but you'll see some of the same things. Like you can see across the board here, there's this idea of children and youth kind of reverting to younger behaviors, or in some cases, like developing new fears, having nightmares, crying, having difficulty sleeping. As kids get older, they'll move into some of the behaviors that are like isolation behaviors, depression, and so these are the things that educators want to really look out for when it comes to trauma. Just to kind of close out this introduction section, having a deep understanding of what are the impacts, the long-term impacts as people move into adulthood. You can see these are very serious. So having to do with drug and alcohol abuse, depression, and even suicide. And these are all the things that we want to prevent in our schools and help our students really navigate through the world safely. So how does this all connect to the environment? Well, when it comes to the environment, more recent research has shown that it's not that many of these things are happening in individual households. And so those are the ones that we refer to as adverse childhood experiences. But then there's things that are happening on this more collective front, and that's what's on the bottom. And this is referred to as the pair of ACEs. And it's really looking at adverse community environments. And in this case over here on the left, you can see they kind of they allude to this idea of poor housing quality and deterioration of physical environment. So they're really bringing up things that have to do with pollution or poor water quality or poor air quality. And so I'm going to go a little further and use the World Health Organization's infographic that calls these things specifically out. So things like air pollution, water sanitation issues, poisons and chemicals, even just noise pollution, agriculture problems, all these things that really contribute to a building sense of chronic trauma and chronic health issues. Now, who's most impacted by this? When you look at the statistics and facts, it's definitely our most youngest children and our most elderly adults. And that too many deaths are attributed to these types of environmental issues. And where this is happening across the world, you can see there's an imbalance across our world, right? So you can see in some of our most densest areas with some of the more challenged infrastructure issues, you're having the most people be impacted by environmental issues. I think it's really useful to scale this back to California and really think about at the local level what's going on in terms of pollution burden in our communities. So where are people being exposed to pollutions, and where are there some really dangerous environmental effects that they are also being exposed to? and thinking through like how does this then show up into things like asthma and cardiovascular disease, and then how does compounding socioeconomic factors really make some of these things worse. So when you think about that pair of aces and that community trauma, these are the types of things that you can now see in a map. And this is just a really important resource for people to look at, to really understand. And you can see right here in this picture, the more red a community is, the deeper the challenges that they are facing with environmental issues. So let's go one layer further and introduce the idea of the climate crisis and trauma, and really thinking about this in terms of acute and chronic trauma. So slowing down here for a minute and looking at this graphic, I'll let you think, where can you anticipate potential acute and chronic trauma? And this might be a time to even just like pause your video and take a closer look. Okay, so hopefully you got a chance to do that. And as you're coming back, you probably are recognizing things like wildfires, and things like severe storms or heat waves. Those are like acute issues, but as you were having them year after year, they become chronic trauma issues. And things like drought or just changing weather patterns, those are more of that kind of chronic issues that can, if they become severe and have a natural disaster, then they become traumatic. So the impacts of climate change have really, in the last couple of years, been looked at by many, many thought leaders to try to understand what is this going to do for trauma and health. And you can see that climate change is really going to deeply affect physical health, but also mental health as well. And as people deal with things like sickness and injury and death and these extreme events, we're really going to have other issues come up like conflict and lack of access to resource, and then mental health issues are coming out of that. There's a whole bunch of different graphics that all kind of get at the same thing, but I just wanted people to see that there's a lot of research behind this. So that first one, this is a really important graphic from the World Health Organization. The Center for Disease Control has their own graphic, really reiterating many of the same things, but going specifically into which ones are going to cause which outcomes. And then the APA has also looked at this in terms of most vulnerable populations and who's really going to be impacted, at physical health, mental health, and community health. So I just want to end this by looking at expanding that pair of aces. So this idea of adverse childhood experiences, adverse community experiences, and now this idea of compounding that with climate disasters, and how each one of those climate disasters can in itself be acute trauma, but building up over the years can lead to chronic trauma. And no matter where you're living, if you're in California or beyond, but if you're in California, you are probably getting familiar with this idea of wildfire trauma and air pollution, and what that's doing to our students. And even if you're living in one part of the country, but you're witnessing this happening everywhere else, hearing constantly that it's going to get worse, that we're not doing enough to stop it, all of those things can cause extra trauma on top of that, especially for our children and youth who feel like they don't have a lot of decision-making power over what's happening right now to their environment. So let's just close this out with this idea that the climate crisis really pushes us into a space that is referred to as a VUCA world. So one that is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. There's still so much that we can do to mitigate these impacts, but really stepping into this space that we are now moving more into adaptation as well, and having an understanding of how trauma shows up in that space is really important. So we're going to do a second video that I encourage you to go to visit, that will really be looking at these things, at trauma-informed practices and social and emotional learning, and what schools can do to connect to social and emotional health and develop resilient practices that will allow for their school communities to be more trauma-informed, especially when it comes to the environment and climate change.